Gravity is arguably the most familiar force in our everyday lives. From the time we are children, we accept a simple truth: everything falls down. Toss a ball into the air and it returns to your hands. Pour water and it rushes down the hill. It is so undeniably obvious that we rarely give it a second thought. Official science insists that gravity behaves exactly the same way across the entire planet. They tell us it is completely understood, perfectly captured in neat equations, and holds no lingering surprises. The experts are absolutely certain that after Newton and Einstein, the debate is closed. But here is the problem with absolute certainty, hidden across our world. There are strange pockets of Earth where gravity acts as if it has never heard of those rigid scientific formulas. We are talking about places where water stubbornly flows up a steep slope, and heavy objects roll uphill against all logic, places where you can physically feel your own body suddenly become lighter or inexplicably heavy. For centuries, the locals knew about these strange zones. They preserved this knowledge in ancient legends and whispered warnings to passing travelers. For the longest time, mainstream science simply waved these stories away, writing them off as mere optical illusions or primitive superstitions. But we cannot dismiss the truth forever. In recent decades, serious expeditions arrived with advanced measuring equipment. What they found shattered the old assumptions. Something is genuinely wrong here, and the data is so severe that it challenges the very foundations of modern physics. Today, you and I are going to unpack this mystery together. We will examine 5 distinct points on the map where gravity simply refuses to follow the rules. Our first destination is the Hessdalen Valley in Norway. Picture a narrow mountain trench in the rugged heart of Scandinavia, stretching barely 12 kilometers, surrounded by cold peaks, quiet birch groves, and isolated farmhouses. It looks incredibly peaceful, but the people who live here know better. For generations, they have called it the Valley of the Restless Lights. Starting in the 1980s, something woke up. Bright, glowing orbs began to appear on a regular basis. They would hover silently in the freezing air, drift deliberately against the wind, shift their colors, and then vanish without a single trace. This happened night after night, year after year. At first, the scientific community offered a lazy explanation, claiming they were just ball lightning, a normal weather event in the mountains. But we know it is never that simple. When researchers finally established a permanent station in the valley, bringing in heavy radar systems, magnetometers, and gravimeters, they uncovered something far more bizarre than floating lights. The instruments revealed that in specific pockets of the valley, the actual force of gravity was drastically different from what mathematical models predicted. We are not talking about a minor drift here. The shift was massive, exceeding the acceptable margin of error by tens of times. Normally, scientists blame minor gravity tweaks on different densities of underground rock. The standard theory is simple. If heavy iron ore lies beneath your feet, gravity pulls a tiny bit harder. If there are hollow caves, the pull is slightly weaker. That is normal and widely understood. But the anomaly in this valley was on an entirely different scale. In one specific spot, which the research team dubbed the Alpha Zone, the machines consistently registered a shockingly weak gravitational pull. This was not a momentary glitch or a passing fluke. It was a permanent, stable distortion. It did not care about the changing weather, the time of day, or the shifting seasons. It was simply always there, defying logic. Intrigued, one of the expedition physicists decided to run a beautifully simple test. He took a solid steel ball and placed it onto a flat testing platform. Before setting the ball down, the team meticulously checked the surface using a precision laser level. It was absolutely, undeniably horizontal. There was not the slightest tilt in any direction. And yet the heavy steel ball began to roll. It did not roll downward because there was no downward slope. Instead, it moved directly toward the center of the anomaly, drawn to the exact spot where the gravitational pull was measurably weaker. According to every known law of physics, it should have stayed perfectly still, or perhaps drifted toward an area of stronger attraction. The researchers repeated the test dozens of times. They swapped out the metal balls, built new platforms, and brought in skeptical independent observers to watch. Every single time, the ball rolled where it shouldn't. If the rolling steel ball was strange. The local streams passing through this anomalous zone were even more unsettling. The freezing water in these creeks visibly flowed against the natural incline of the mountain. The old farmers who worked this land knew about this for generations, playfully, calling them the stubborn streams, claiming the water had a mind of its own. Predictably, mainstream science rushed in to declare it an optical illusion. They argued that the surrounding terrain was naturally tilted, the trees grew at odd angles, and the human eye was merely being tricked into seeing water flow uphill. It is the classic, safe explanation officials used to dismiss similar mysteries around the globe. But then, professional surveyors arrived with precision satellite mapping systems to uncover the truth. The satellite data destroyed the illusion theory completely. The physical slope of the Earth genuinely pointed in one direction, while the heavy water stubbornly flowed in the exact opposite way. The difference was incredibly subtle, just a few centimeters over a stretch of dozens of meters, but it was absolutely real, documented, and endlessly repeatable. The evidence forces us to conclude that in this forgotten valley, gravity does not simply pull straight down toward the core, it pulls sideways. And that bizarre lateral drag is strong enough to reverse a flowing stream. The locals shared one more chilling detail with the investigators. On the dark nights when the glowing orbs danced overhead, people standing below felt a sudden, strange physical lightness, as if the earth itself was letting go. I remember reading the account of an elderly woman who had spent her entire life in that isolated valley. She recalled her grandmother warning her about the times when the lights came. The old woman called them the nights when the earth breathes. She warned her family never to step outside into the dark, fearing they might lose their anchor and drift away, trapped between heaven and earth. A skeptic would smile and call it a beautiful piece of folklore. We have heard countless stories just like it, but when researchers placed highly sensitive monitoring equipment inside the homes of local volunteers, the hard data backed up the ancient myth. During the exact moments the anomalous lights flared in the sky above, the machines recorded sudden, violent spikes in the local gravitational field. For a fraction of a second, a human being genuinely became about 150 grams lighter. It is not enough to make you float off into the freezing night sky, but it is more than enough for your inner ear and muscles to register the sudden shift. The old grandmother was absolutely right. The earth was breathing. This brings us to our second location, Mount Brocken in Germany, standing just over 1,000 meters tall in the rugged Harz Mountains. It is far from the highest peak in Europe, but it carries a deeply unsettling reputation. For centuries, the locals whispered that this was the ultimate gathering place for dark magic. It is the very mountain Goethe chose for the demonic Walpurgis night in his masterpiece, Faust. Wrapped in a suffocating fog nearly all year, it earns its dread. If you wander into that thick, clinging mist, you might witness something truly terrifying. They call it the Brocken specter. Without warning, your own shadow is projected onto a massive wall of clouds, twisted into a towering, monstrous silhouette framed by a glowing rainbow halo. It is a heart-stopping sight for anyone standing alone on the rocks. Now, meteorologists quickly explain this away as a simple refraction of light through water droplets. Nothing paranormal, just a rare atmospheric trick. But Mount Brocken hides deeper secrets that cannot be brushed off with a basic physics textbook. Way back in the late 19th century, a German geophysicist dragged his heavy measuring equipment to the desolate summit. To his utter confusion, the brass dials refused to lock onto the correct gravitational values. The discrepancy in his readings was relatively small, so the establishment did what it always does: they blamed the machinery. They argued the device was old, the freezing weather ruined the calibration, and it was simply human error. The anomaly was quietly buried in the archives. Fast forward to the 1970s, when a sharp group of physics students from Göttingen University hiked up the mountain with their own gear. They decided to map the gravity field using mechanical pendulums. The core principle is beautifully simple: a pendulum of a specific length will always swing at the exact same speed if the pull of the Earth is standard. If the invisible grip of gravity strengthens, the swing speeds up. If the pull weakens, the swinging rhythm noticeably slows down. It is absolute baseline physics, the kind of undisputed fact you build skyscrapers on. Yet, up there in the freezing fog of Mount Brocken, the brass pendulum swung just a fraction of a second slower than the laws of nature demanded. It was not a sluggishness you could catch with the naked eye, but the precision instruments recorded it without a doubt. The young students meticulously logged their findings and published a cautious report in their university journal. The broader scientific community completely ignored it. No esteemed professor wanted to stake their reputation on a bizarre student paper about a haunted mountain. It was not until our modern era, when investigators finally hauled digital, ultrasensitive equipment up the slope to build a high-resolution gravity map, that the undeniable, strange truth finally emerged. The new data revealed that the anomaly was not randomly smeared across the rock face. Instead, it was concentrated into several highly specific, isolated points. When plotted on a map, these dead zones formed an almost perfect geometric triangle. Right in the dead center of this triangle, directly beneath the summit, gravity was measurably weaker. At the three outer corners, it pulled noticeably stronger. It was an impossibly clean, unnatural structure. Desperate for a rational answer, geologists suggested there must be massive hollow caves in the center and dense iron deposits at the corners. It sounded perfectly logical on paper, but when heavy drilling rigs chewed deep into the mountain, they hit nothing but solid, uniform granite. There were no hidden caves. There was no heavy ore, just ordinary stone that should act normally. Let's pause and look at this together, because the mystery deepens here. Why the rock behaves this way, nobody knows. Down on the northern slope lies a 200-meter stretch of decaying asphalt. Park a car here, kill the engine, release the brake, and the vehicle slowly rolls straight up the incline. Skeptics predictably played their favorite card, optical illusion, claiming the road actually dips downwards. To settle it, engineers scanned the terrain with military lasers and satellites down to the millimeter. The verdict: the road genuinely slopes upward at a 2-degree angle. No illusions. They repeated the test 14 distinct times. They used heavy off-road vehicles, compact cars, and even a completely non-magnetic cart made of pure aluminum. The results never changed. The metal always moved the wrong way. You are watching over a ton of dead metal effortlessly roll up a steep hill. The only remaining explanation is that the local gravitational field is literally pulling sideways. This invisible force takes a heavy toll on the human body, too. Hikers constantly report feeling a strange vibration traveling up through their boots, followed by a sudden wave of dizziness. Medical doctors quickly wrote this off as mere autosuggestion, so researchers conducted a blind test. They covered the eyes of volunteers and led them across the mountain slopes. stripped of visual cues. Over 70% correctly identified the exact moment they crossed into the anomalous zone, citing tingling feet and sudden vertigo. This brings us to our third enigma, the Marcahuasi Plateau in Peru, hidden in the towering Andes. 4,000 meters high lies a jagged expanse the native tribes call the place where the gods played with stones. Let's take a look at Marcahuasi. It is roughly 4 kilometers of nothing but stone, biting wind, and absolute silence. Hidden 80 kilometers northeast of Lima, Peru. Reaching this plateau is not for the faint of heart. The final stretch forces you up a narrow, dangerous mountain trail on foot. But those who finally make the climb step into a world that defies simple logic. The entire surface is scattered with massive stone monolith shaped like human faces, wild animals, and mythical beasts. Mainstream science will confidently tell you this is just basic erosion. They claim millions of years of wind and rain carved these bizarre forms into the soft volcanic rock, and our brains simply trick us into seeing familiar shapes. But is it really that simple? They call it pareidolia. It is the psychological tendency to see faces and figures in random patterns, much like spotting animals in the clouds. It sounds perfectly reasonable on paper. But you and I are going to unpack this story together, because the stones are only the very first layer of the Marcahuasi mystery. Since the 1950s, travelers who made it up there started reporting something deeply unsettling. In certain spots, you suddenly feel an intense lightness, almost like true weightlessness. People describe a sudden urge to jump, feeling as though a strong push would send them drifting into the sky. Yet in other areas, a crushing weight slams down on you. It feels like a heavy sandbag was dropped across your shoulders. Your legs turn to lead and you just collapse. The strangest part is how fast these sensations shift. You walk 10 steps in one direction and you feel light as a feather. You walk 10 steps back and you can barely lift your feet. For decades, medical experts quickly dismissed all of this as basic mountain sickness. At an altitude of 4,000 meters, oxygen is incredibly thin. Blood pressure drops, the body struggles, and people start imagining things. That explanation sounded entirely convincing, at least until the year 2003. That was when a team of professional geophysicists finally arrived with specialized measuring equipment. They set out to map the gravitational field of Marcahuasi. The entire plateau is made of uniform volcanic tuff, according to every known geological rule. The gravity there should be perfectly flat, but the machines painted a vastly different picture. The force of gravity was jumping wildly from point to point, showing variations several times stronger than the rock composition could possibly allow. The most shocking detail was the harsh borders between these zones. There was no smooth, natural transition. It was like stepping off a sharp cliff. You measure one gravity value here, take a single step 2 meters to the left, and find a completely different reading. And here is where the forgotten truth bleeds through, when the researchers overlaid the new gravity map directly. On top of the old reports of human physical sensations, they lined up flawlessly. Where the machines recorded reduced gravity, people had felt weightless. Where the sensors spiked, bodies felt crushed, a perfect, impossible match. These deeply subjective human feelings, which the scientific establishment had brushed off as mere altitude sickness, turned out to be a dead-on reflection of real physical anomalies. But the mystery goes even deeper. When investigators layered the gravity data over a map of the giant stone figures, a chilling pattern emerged. The largest, most distinct sculptures were standing perfectly along the sharp borders of the gravity zones. It was as if someone from the distant past deliberately planted them there as warning signs. To test this further, the science team set up a rigid experiment. They placed identical swinging pendulums across the plateau, spaced exactly 50 meters apart. By every law of physics, they should have maintained the exact same rhythm, yet they swung at completely different speeds. Standard physics tells us that a visible difference in a pendulum swing is only possible if the objects are separated by hundreds of kilometers, not 50 meters, yet here they were, sitting on the exact same flat plateau, at the exact same elevation, defying the rules of motion, while the scientists scratched their heads. The local native guides brought them to another anomaly. They called it the Dream Stone. According to ancient local myth, any person who lies flat against this rock will fall fast asleep within mere minutes. It does not matter how much coffee you drank or how rested you are. The rock simply shuts you down. The researchers immediately laughed this off as the natural fatigue of hiking at 4,000 meters, but they were curious enough to wire up a few volunteers and test it anyway. They hooked the volunteers up to medical sensors to monitor their exact heart rates and brainwave activity, then asked them to lie down on the rock. The resulting data was absolutely staggering. Within moments, their heart rates plummeted. Their brain waves shifted rapidly into an altered state, mirroring the deep trance of advanced meditation. And when they checked the gravimeter positioned right next to the stone, the mystery locked into place. This exact spot registered as the deepest gravitational pit on the entire mountain. The physical pull of the Earth was at its absolute weakest right where the sleepers lay. It suggests that this localized drop in gravity physically overrides the human nervous system, forcing the heart to slow down and flipping the brain into a totally different mode. If these findings are ever officially acknowledged, it will blow the doors wide open on an entirely new branch of science, bridging raw physics and human biology. Now, let us leave the mountains and travel to our next destination. Deep in Russia lies Lake Baikal. It is the deepest freshwater lake on the planet, plunging more than 1.5 kilometers down into the dark. Baikal is basically a separate universe of strange phenomena. But there is one specific anomaly that the academic world prefers to ignore. The first whispers that something was deeply wrong with the gravity here surfaced back in the 1960s. Top-secret Soviet geophysicists were quietly mapping the Siberian region for military ballistic calculations. They rigidly measured the exact gravitational pull of every single square mile. The readings they pulled out of the Baikal Basin were so bizarre and unpredictable that the military immediately classified the entire operation. It was not until the collapse of the Soviet Union that those dusty archives were finally opened to the public. The leaked documents revealed a gravity field with a chaotic structure that violently breaks standard geological models. Modern official science tries to explain away the Baikal anomaly with a simple excuse. They point out that the lake sits directly over a major tectonic rift zone. The Earth's crust is supposedly stretched paper-thin here, allowing the boiling, dense mantle to rise much closer to the surface. They claim this extreme contrast in deep underground rock density is what creates such massive distortions in the local gravitational field. It sounds incredibly logical. The experts look at the data, shrug their shoulders, and confidently declare that there is nothing to see here but normal geology. But we are looking for the forgotten layers of truth, right? In 2009, the famous Mir deep water submersibles dove to the absolute bottom of the lake, packed with high-tech sensors, down in the crushing blackness. Those machines picked up a signal that completely shattered the standard theory. The gravity on the lake bed was not a static, heavy pull. It was actually pulsing. It would grow stronger then slightly weaker, following a precise, rhythmic cycle. One complete pulse took exactly 12 minutes. These were not random glitches, equipment errors, or background noise. It was a clear, impossible mechanical beat under the earth. The fluctuations were incredibly smooth and highly stable. It felt exactly like a massive lung breathing in the deep dark. Mainstream academics usually blame this kind of variance on the distant pull of the sun and the moon, claiming they stretch the planet and cause tidal shifts, but the rhythmic heartbeat of Baikal did not match a single known lunar or solar cycle. 12 minutes is far too fast to be the moon and far too slow to be a trembling earthquake. The researchers were totally stumped. They quietly filed the data away and kept it out of the public press. It was simply too inconvenient. Meanwhile, the native Siberian tribes have insisted for centuries that the Great Lake is actually a living, breathing entity. Generations of local fishermen have always avoided certain dead zones on the water. They speak of areas where a boat will suddenly freeze in place. There is no wind, no surface current, but rowing becomes utterly useless. In other strange spots, a boat will smoothly glide forward with zero human effort, as if an invisible hand is pushing it along. The textbooks try to blame this on hidden thermal currents, but the locals experience the exact same forces in the dead of winter. When the lake is sealed beneath 3 solid feet of ice, there is no wind beneath that frozen shell, yet the push remains. To prove it, a team walked out onto the winter ice and set up an astonishing experiment. They placed a long row of highly sensitive measuring scales directly on the frozen surface, every 100 meters. They dropped an identical, measured metal weight onto the solid ice. If the Earth's downward pull was completely normal, every single scale should have displayed the exact same number. Instead, the heavy numbers fractured. They did not just change randomly. They shifted in a clear, rolling pattern. One scale read heavier, the next one dropped lighter, and the third spiked heavy again. It was a tangible wave rippling straight down the frozen line. The bewildered experts could only conclude that they were watching a literal gravitational wave tearing through the deep bedrock. Up until that cold morning, human science had only ever detected gravity waves echoing from collapsing black holes in deep space. To catch those ripples, we built massive laser tunnels miles long. Here, they caught a violently powerful signal using ordinary metal scales, sitting directly on top of the ice. Whatever caused this massive ripple was not a dying star in a distant galaxy. It was something buried deep beneath their boots, and nobody on Earth knows exactly what it is. Just slightly north, on the edge of Alkan Island, lies a jagged cliff known as Cape Kabu. This rocky point has been deeply sacred to the native shamans for centuries. Here, the measuring machines picked up another wild drop in gravity. One of the lead biologists noticed something deeply eerie about the cliff itself. Despite being perfectly sheltered from the screaming wind and covered in prime nesting ledges, there was not a single bird on the rock. Every surrounding cliff was swarming with them, but this one was completely barren. The local wildlife clearly senses a hidden force that our blind human bodies simply ignore. For thousands of years, the ancient shamans have protected this cliff, calling it a raw node of power. It looks like they understood a physical truth that modern science is only just beginning to measure. Now, follow me to our next destination. The Danakil Desert in Ethiopia is easily the most hostile environment we will explore today. We are talking about temperatures past 120 degrees, shattered lava fields, toxic lakes, and active volcanoes. The local tribes simply call this tortured wasteland the gates of hell. They pass down grim warnings about cursed patches of dirt that physically drag a man down into the deep. Geologists calmly explain that 3 massive tectonic plates are ripping apart right beneath the searing sand. To prove this theory, a bold expedition set up 20 sensor stations out in the scorching heat. They left the machines running for 3 brutal months. When they finally reviewed the data, They found a 15-kilometer dead zone sitting exactly in the center of the desert. Inside this invisible ring, the downward pull of gravity was drastically weaker than any math could predict. This is a massive violation of basic physics, and the strangest part is that this weak zone did not line up with a single volcano or empty magma chamber. It was nestled perfectly between them. It behaved as if some unknown object buried in the crust was actively generating a counter field to push back against the Earth. Inside this exact zone, they discovered a wild phenomenon the team quietly nicknamed the flicker. The gravity was violently spiking up and down, exactly like a dying light bulb. The expedition boss immediately assumed the harsh desert heat had melted their sensors. Let us look at this piece by piece, shall we? The lead researcher swapped out every single sensor, and when that failed, he ordered a brand new suite of top-tier equipment from Europe. But the readouts refused to change. The gravity in this exact spot was genuinely flickering. The local Afar guides simply nodded. They call this place the Eye of the Earth. According to their oldest legends, if you place a stone in the center of this zone, it begins to shiver and lightly bounce. Naturally, the science team brushed this off as tiny earthquakes. After all, this is a volcanic region where the ground is almost always humming. Still, curiosity took hold. They arranged several rocks on a flat basalt slab right in the dead center of the anomaly and set a camera to watch. 3 hours later, they reviewed the footage. What they saw defied standard physics. One of the stones, weighing roughly 2 kilograms, was actually performing microscopic jumps. It was lifting off the solid rock by a fraction of a millimeter, over and over again. Yet the highly sensitive vibration meter sitting just 2 meters away registered absolute zero. The Earth was completely still. That stone was not bouncing because the ground was shaking. It was moving because the fundamental force pulling it downward was fluctuating. That was the precise moment when even the most hardened skeptics in the research camp fell completely silent. But as unsettling as the bouncing stones were, the greatest discovery of this entire expedition was actually tied to the flow of time itself. The team set up 2 incredibly precise atomic clocks, the kind that might lose a single second over millions of years. One went directly into the anomaly, and the other sat at a safe distance. A month later, they compared the data. The clock inside the zone had moved forward. It was a tiny shift, but absolutely measurable. Einstein taught us that where gravity is weaker, time moves faster. We have proven that for decades, but here is the catch. The gap between these 2 clocks was 10 times larger than it should have been based on the gravity readings. This leaves us with 2 staggering possibilities. Either our best machines are only catching a faint whisper of a massive anomaly, or the ancient rules binding gravity and time operate completely differently in this exact spot. Both of those possibilities present a massive challenge to modern physics. So now we have 5 distinct locations scattered across different continents. A quiet Norwegian valley, an isolated German mountain, a high Peruvian plateau, a freezing Siberian lake, and a scorching Ethiopian desert. They share absolutely nothing in common when it comes to climate or geology, yet they all point to the exact same shocking conclusion. Gravity on our planet is nowhere near as predictable as the textbooks claim. And we can no longer brush this off as faulty equipment or the wild imaginations of passing tourists. These gravity anomalies are stable, they are fully reproducible, and they have been confirmed again and again by completely independent scientific expeditions. Stick with me, because this is where the pieces connect. These zones are actively warping water, physical objects, and even the march of time. Mainstream science insists this is just unusual geology, But standard models cannot explain the rhythmic pulsations on Lake Baikal, the dead zones on a German mountain, or the flickering forces in the Ethiopian desert. If you take them one by one, you could wave them away as odd coincidences. But together they are shouting a clear message. We are missing something massive. There might be titanic forces churning deep underground that we cannot even begin to comprehend yet. These 5 locations are open windows into the unknown, reminding us that local myth often becomes our next scientific breakthrough. It is easy to forget how much of our accepted reality was once considered impossible. The very concept of unseen radioactivity sounded like absolute magic to the brightest minds of the 19th century. When the idea of continental drift was first proposed, it was met with literal laughter in academic halls. We might be standing on the exact same threshold right now with gravity. We are seeing the cracks in the foundation, the tiny anomalies that refuse to fit neatly into our established equations. If these 5 mysterious zones are truly showing us the raw, unfiltered mechanics of our planet, we are not just looking at a few geographical oddities. We are looking at the exact reason why every physics textbook on Earth will eventually have to be rewritten.